It may seem an insignificant detail that he developed his major philosophical ideas when walking in the alpine landscape. Ideas jotted on scraps of paper when breathing the air of the heights are later deciphered and transcribed, the pencil scratchings sometimes proving unintelligible, the connections between the ideas sometimes eluding even Nietzsche himself. Irrespective of the eventual formulation of these notes, one can only marvel at this method of philosophy. Picking his way across paths half seen, groping tentacle-like across mountain terrain, endlessly scanning the horizon, which falls away before the poorly focused gaze, Nietzsche navigated paths to new experiences with little more than a sense of atmospheric electricity as a compass. In the beautiful introduction to his text Nietzsche and the Vicious Circle, Pierre Klossowski describes Nietzsche's work as flashes of summer lightning that a destiny sends our way from the horizon of our century. Rejecting the practice of evaluating Nietzsche's thinking according to certain norms of the intellect from which the philosopher singularly takes his leave, Klossowski's attention alights on the background of Nietzsche's thinking, the mute intensity of the tonality of the soul, as he so designates it in his own distinctive idiom. There is no denying that Klossowski's text on Nietzsche is profoundly odd. It is certainly peculiar that his engagement with Nietzsche's thinking should focus on his letters and notes rather than on the main published works, and certainly idiosyncratic that he should take the landmarks of his thinking to be places where thought occurs. Two notable points in Nietzsche's thinking for Klossowski are his Sils Maria experience of the thought of eternal return in August 1881 and his euphoria of Turin, the final days of a kind of delirial lucidity prior to his mental collapse in early January 1889. Despite the specificity of this focus, however, Klossowski's interest lies not within Nietzsche's biography as such, but with the peaks and valleys of his psychogeography. One of the most distinctive aspects of his approach is his emphasis on the relationship between Nietzsche's valetudinary states and his thinking. This focus arises out of the broader insight that Nietzsche's thought meditated on lived experience, on the act of thinking, and is within this context that he insists on engaging with the eternal return as an experience, most specifically, most obsessively, the Sils Maria experience. In what follows, I propose to explore Klossowski's unusual obsession with Nietzsche's body, his attention to Nietzsche's intensive affective states. Klossowski is at pains to establish that the body gains an essential prominence in Nietzsche's work, that eternal return is une pensée corporante, a bodying thought, and that his atrocious health, his migraines, neuralgias, gastric disorders, and eye strain are fundamental material conditions for the production of his philosophy. In the spirit of Klossowski's approach, I propose to develop his account of Nietzsche's experience of the thought of eternal return in Simulacra, asking what is articulated in and by this proper name. These reflections on landscapes and headaches lead from Simulacra to Turin and into a more general reflection on what takes place at the edge of things. Klossowski remarks early on in Nietzsche and the Vicious Circle that Nietzsche's method was to take long walks, his thoughts coming to him step by step. When his migraines were so severe that he was unable to read his assembled notes, he would delegate the task to Peter Gast. Sometimes the headaches were so menacing that he had to abandon all the normative habits of philosophy. This is the first quotation on the handout. Nietzsche was often forced to give up all reading, all writing, all reflection. He followed a treatment, a diet, he changed climate. Moreover, he distrusted therapeutics. Little by little, he managed to invent a therapy of his own, derived from his own observations. Once he recovered his faculties, he tried to describe this suspension of thought, to reflect on the cerebral functioning in relation to other organic functions, and he began to distrust his own brain. After each of these crises, Klossowski claims, Nietzsche was gripped by a euphoria that led him to scrutinise ever more carefully the forces that had been revealed through the disturbances of his organism. In this way, sickness functions as an unexpected stimulant to philosophy, the periods of respite enabling Nietzsche to analyse, assess and refine his experiences as primary data of research. Headaches play a decisive role in Klossowski's meditations because he suggests that it is as a result of these attacks that Nietzsche's distrust of reason is consummated. This is the second quotation. The agonising migraines which Nietzsche experienced periodically as an aggression that suspended his thought were not an external aggression. The root of the evil was in himself, in his own organism. His own physical self was attacking in order to defend itself against a dissolution. But what was being threatened with dissolution? Nietzsche's own brain. Klossowski claims that convalescence was a new offensive of the body against the thinking Nietzsche self. In its relapses and recoveries, the body liberated itself a little more from its own agent, and in each case, this agent weakened a little more. Progressively, Nietzsche came to develop the notion that the body is a product of chance. It is nothing but the locus, le lieu, where a group of individuated impulses confront each other so as to produce this interval that constitutes a human life. The fluctuating impulses of the body are irreducible and incommunicable. Always at play in the movement of thought, they resist translation into its signs, withdrawing from the categories of language and comprehension deployed to denote their existence. For Klossowski, the unity of the person, or ego, is a purely institutional designation, a psychiatric label, and part of the everyday code of signs, which imposes a spurious continuity on the flickering multitude of excitations, driving them together into a stable self. Klossowski argues that the furious assaults of Nietzsche's illness precipitate him into isolation and abandonment to the tonalities of his soul, and it is during one such moment that the ecstasy of eternal return takes hold. Klossowski suggests that it is in the suspension of Nietzsche's thinking, compelled by the complete shutdown occasioned by the migraines that another kind of lucidity becomes palpable. In these moments, the body comes to challenge the coherence of the self. This life, a kind of life from which the human is uncannily estranged, is the necessary condition for thinking or for receiving the thought of eternal return. In the highest pitch of intensity, a thought is excited into existence with an extreme suddenness and certainty, its impact felt with the full force of catastrophe. And Klossowski emphasises the point that eternal return is primarily a lived experience, a revelation. According to Klossowski, the thought of eternal return retains its potency only as a revelatory power. As such, it's a tremendous agent of dissolution, corroding the habits of thought that would fix it into a doctrine. For Nietzsche's doctrine is paradoxically unteachable, lacking the character of meaning once and for all that would render it available in the world of signs. To the extent that it thinks an existence outside of thought, it can never coincide with itself as a doctrine, but more than this, it nullifies the very identity of the thinker once and for all. As Klossowski so memorably puts it, this thought is so perfectly coherent that it excludes me at the very moment I think it. A limit is surpassed in which I can no longer discern the difference between fluctuations from without and from within. I particularly like that formulation, and it's important, I think, for the Sils-Maria experience. So, on Klossowski's exquisite reading, Nietzsche's valetudinary states lead him to experience the body in such a way that the encounter with eternal return becomes possible. It seems that there is a further sense in which this insight is invaluable, one which would develop Klossowski's idea of the body as a place or locus where impulses confront each other. As someone who was acutely sensitive to seemingly minor and imperceptible changes in atmospheric conditions, Nietzsche regarded his pathology as a vital resource for his genealogical speculations. Convinced that minute changes in atmospheric pressure and electricity in the clouds had a deleterious effect on his physiology, Nietzsche made experimentation with different climatic conditions an essential aspect of his philosophical practice. In numerous places, he alludes to this unusual sort of heightened sensitivity, and his trial of different dwelling places from the mountain heights to the coastal plains is a constant refrain in both his published writings and in his private correspondence. In the second section of Why I Am So Clever, in Ecce Homo, for example, Nietzsche claims to be long practiced at using his body to read off climatic and meteorological effects as if from a very subtle and reliable instrument, and declares that he is able to register changes in the degrees of humidity on himself physiologically. There are many letters in which Nietzsche is talking about his health and sickness and the search for ideal conditions in which to philosophize. The next quotation on the handout is from a letter to Peter Gast, who of course also goes by the name of Heinrich Koselleck. It is burdensome for my nature to find the right place with respect to heights and depths. At bottom involves a groping. There are factors which cannot be strictly grasped, for example, the electricity in the drifting clouds and the effects of the wind. I'm convinced that I have these influences to thank for 80% of my torment. In a letter to Elizabeth, his sister, He lists the locations and resorts detrimental to his health, and he does have lists and graphs of like rainfall and changes in atmospheric pressure. And he goes on to remark that the Engadine offers him some respite from the severity of his attacks. He still has the headaches, but he says, I experience continual calm and none of the pressure that I feel everywhere else. In his copious correspondence from this period, Nietzsche frequently commends the air, the light, the altitude of the Swiss landscape, Sils Maria being his greatest discovery. In the famous letter to Peter Gast, August 1881, Nietzsche acknowledges an intense intimacy with this landscape, vowing to retain this Sils Maria in his life forever. At the opening to chapter 3 of Nietzsche and the Vicious Circle, Klossowski cites from the first part of Nietzsche's letter to Peter Gast from the 14th of August 1881. Without directly engaging with its detail, he notes that the thought of the eternal return of the same came to Nietzsche as an abrupt awakening in the midst of a Stimmung, a certain tonality of soul. He then proceeds to develop his magisterial reading of the functioning of forgetting and anamnesis in the lived experience of eternal return. In the process, the letter to Gast itself is forgotten, its role as testimony to the ecstatic nature of Nietzsche's experience, seemingly having been served. And I'm not saying that he should engage with this letter, it's his book, he can sort of do what he wants. It's simply that in chapter 2 he cites 6 letters about the headaches and the valetudinary states, which he's drawing on that to develop the wonderful reading about the origins of Nietzsche's semiotic. So, although Klossowski never pursues the question why the Sils Maria experience is a Sils Maria experience, it's worth abiding with this locution and to think in doing so about the location. So the letter to Gast offers some clues, and the first part is the 4th quotation on the handout. The August sun is overhead. The year is slipping away. The mountains and forests are becoming more quiet and peaceful. On my horizon, thoughts have arisen such as I have never seen before. I will not speak of them, but will maintain my unshakable calm. I suppose now I'll have to live a few years longer. Ah, my friends, sometimes the idea runs through my head that I'm living an extremely dangerous life, for I am one of those machines which can explode. The intensity of my feelings makes me shudder and laugh. Several times I've been unable to leave my room for the ridiculous reason that my eyes were inflamed. From what? On each occasion I had wept too much on my wanderings the day before. Not sentimental tears, mind you, but tears of joy. I sang and talked nonsense filled with a glimpse of things which put me in advance of all other men. The excitement Nietzsche reports at the emergence of unimagined thoughts on his horizon has an infectious pull on the reader, drawing us into this vortex of intensity. Nietzsche tells of the noonday sun, the slipping away of the year, and the quietening of the mountains and forests. But there's something uncanny about this landscape. Nietzsche confides that thoughts are physically looming upon his horizon, as if the landscape is showing something to him that words could only guess at. At any rate, he vows not to speak of them to maintain an unshakable calm. And yet this is a suspicious kind of equanimity, since it has the power to blow itself apart, shuddering, laughing, weeping uncontrollably, singing and talking nonsense out on these eerily silent hills. This is surely as delirial as it gets. In this noontide ecstasy, this moment without shadow, something is glimpsed from beyond the limits of the human. It is a view at the edge of things. Nietzsche notes, and thus spoke Zarathustra, that the thought of eternal return came to him when out walking by the lake of Silverplana. Stopping by a pyramidal boulder, the thought suddenly came to him and was scribbled down on a piece of paper 6,000 feet beyond man and time. Nietzsche's notebooks of this period do contain a note entitled The Thought of Eternal Return, which concludes in much this way. It's actually a sketch for incorporating the thought of eternal return, and the word Einverleibung is a good translation. Incorporation is a good translation of the word Einverleibung, because it literally means taking something into the body. So in these sketches, he talks about teaching the doctrine as being the best means for incorporating this thought, for making it part of the body. As Klossowski notes, the experience of eternal return became obscure once Nietzsche attempted to initiate his friends into it, as if it were a doctrine of the understanding. It also becomes obsessive, and Klossowski suggests that Nietzsche's friends felt the delirium. It is as if the mood of the experience is cast like a shadow by the ciphers of its utterance. And this is Klossowski. When Nietzsche invited them to think with him, he was really inviting them to feel, and thus to feel his own prior emotion. But Nietzsche goes further than this. He also takes people to the place of this emotion, to its body. One of Nietzsche's Swiss acquaintances, Reza von Schönhofer, remarks how Nietzsche had taken her, as he did other visitors, to the Zarathustra stone on the shore of Lake Silverplana, where the thought of eternal return had come to him. Next quotation. He led me, as he led others of his visitors before and after, to the water-washed boulder on the shore of Lake Silverplana, the Zarathustra stone, the wonderful place of serious natural beauty, where the dark green lake, the nearby forest, the high mountains, the solemn silence join in weaving their magic. After I had, at his request, sat down on his sacred stone, Zarathustra began to speak out of the world of his intellectual, emotional high tension, and poured out an abundance of ideas and images in dithyrambic pronouncements. Then he told me of the astonishing rapidity of the origin of each part of the work, an inspiration with which the writing process could hardly keep up. Reza von Schönhofer goes on to describe how, when speaking, Nietzsche's being is set in vibrant unrest. But as they walk further along the lake shore, leaving behind them this enchanted spot, the mysterious vibrations in Nietzsche's being were also lost. No doubt there is something contrived about this reminiscence, but it testifies, notwithstanding, to the importance of this location. Nietzsche retraces the contours of his disarming experience, stepping back into the landscape of memory, seeking to catch the wave of a just unreachable dream. Could it be said that this place had the thought of eternal return? That Nietzsche obsessively revisits the scene to try and re-inhabit the physicality of the moment, a memory outside my own limits, as Klossowski might say. If Nietzsche really does come to distrust his brain as the locus of thought, he trusts the water-washed rocks, the high mountain peaks, the dark green lake and cerulean sky. Experience is a continuation of landscape, by other means. As Nietzsche's search for ideal climate, diet and therapeutics reveal, material processes constantly combine to produce physiologies which, although distinct, are simultaneously continuous with forces which exceed them. In fact, the body is never regarded by Nietzsche as a self-sufficient entity, but a multiplicity of forces which from a particular perspective share a common holding pattern. If it is the case that at every moment there are countless factors influencing us, such as air and electricity, which we seldom sense, there may well be forces that continually influence us, although we never feel them. Only a small fraction of bodily motions and changes actually impinge on consciousness, despite the tendency to take the latter as the sole arbiter of significant activity. Coherent knowledge of our world is only possible because we have forgotten that we fell from the sky as stardust and rain, that we exchanged our gases with plants and our fluids with ditches, that we flowed out through the capillaries of the earth into the vast anonymous tidal swell. The Simulacra experience is fundamentally an experience of the landscape, not of an individuated ego experiencing the landscape. The notes which Nietzsche made in his wanderings in the alpine environment were thought paths, a title he'd planned at one stage for the wanderer and his shadow. If the thought of eternal return belongs to this landscape, perhaps we should start to look elsewhere in Nietzsche's corpus, as it were, for sites of its epiphany. And this really opens up Nietzsche's thinking of eternal return to wonderful, infinite possibilities. I've just put on the handout one example. It's from The Wanderer and His Shadow. At noon, whoever in his life has been granted an active and stormy morning finds an odd craving for tranquility overtakes his soul at life's noontide, a craving that can last for many moons, many years. It grows quiet about him, the voices fade away and are now far off. The sun shines straight down upon him. On a concealed meadow in the forest, he sees great Pan sleeping. All the things of nature have gone to sleep with him, an expression of eternity on their faces. At least that is the way he thinks of it. He wants nothing, is troubled by nothing. His heart stands motionless, and only his eye still lives. It is a death with vigilant eyes. Away from the clamour of the human world, in an oasis of divine enchantment, the wanderer experiences the revelation of the outside, wanting nothing, a spirit untroubled by desire. This is the perfect love of fate, the amor fati, which functions as a seal of affirmation within Nietzsche's landscape of eternal return. In this perfect moment, one experiences that which eludes the categories of knowledge, perception, and understanding. The lived experience of eternal return, the Simulacra experience, is not so much about loss of identity as perception of an utter continuity with things. With his arrival in Turin, an extraordinary change took place in Nietzsche. The headaches and nausea were suddenly gone. His appetite was more vigorous than it had ever been. He felt no pain, never slept better. In a letter, he says, "These weeks in Turin have gone better for me than any during the past few years. Above all, better philosophically. Almost every day I have attained 1 or 2 hours of the energy level I need in order to see my general conception from top to bottom, whereby the vast multiplicity of problems lies spread out beneath me as a relief with clearly defined lines. Obviously, this sudden appearance of a world unmediated and uncushioned by illness was the signature of doom. This health would cost him his life. In his penultimate chapter, The Euphoria of Turin, Klossowski asks, at what point did Nietzsche reach the edge of the abyss? Clearly this is a tendentious question, for the abyss has no horizon, and as Klossowski's text has so compellingly shown, Nietzsche's thought revolved around delirium as its axis. Klossowski suggests that Nietzsche no doubt believed he had gone mad since he received the thought of eternal return, and he asks whether it's conceivable that Nietzsche understood the thought of return as his own madness. The accent of delirium clings to the doctrine, for there is a vertiginous thrill to the notion that nothing ever gets constituted in a single sense once and for all. Of course, this thought, although intoxicating, is in principle beyond experience, because to experience it would be to cut free from moorings in the self-same. In his August 1881 letter to Peter Gast, Nietzsche suggests that he has glimpsed something of this outside. In Reiser von Schönhofer's memoir, there is a similar suggestion, but now with more than a hint of menace, as if the outside has taken root from within. Also on the handout. With a distraught expression on his pale face, he leaned wearily against the post of the half-open door and immediately began to speak about the unbearableness of his ailment. He described to me how, when he closed his eyes, he saw an abundance of fantastic flowers, winding and intertwining, constantly growing and changing forms and colours in exotic luxuriance, sprouting one out of the other. I never get any rest, he complained, words which were implanted in my mind. Then, with his large dark eyes looking straight at me, he asked in his weak voice with disquieting urgency, "Don't you believe that this condition is a symptom of incipient madness? My father died of a brain disease." Madness is the constant threat of flowers. The flower, a universal symbol of thoughtless life, springing out of battlefields and cracks in the rubble of destroyed cities, testifies to life in its pure superabundance. This kaleidoscopic blossoming is an infinite generation of difference, a plenitude of roiling, superabundant life, suspended between waking and sleeping in a kind of generalised insomnia, to borrow Klossowski's apposite phrase. The landscape grows, burgeons, proliferates out of control. There is an erasure of the horizon between Nietzsche's physiology and the landscape. What is the outside for Klossowski? He claims that even when we are alone, silent, speaking internally to ourselves, it is still the outside that is speaking to us, thanks to these signs from the exterior that invade and occupy us, and whose murmuring totally covers over our impulsive life. The clamour of these intensive states or impulses is muffled once they're transmuted by consciousness into the gregarious world of signs. For Klossowski, Nietzsche inhabits the precarious borderland between the chaotic impulses and the seeming coherence of the everyday world. But if it is a question of the extent to which lived experience can be articulated within the gregarious code of signs, a matter of being outside the rules for coherence. This is an outside still thought very much from the inside of things. The experience is not about the loss of signs, but the loss of a horizon. In the famous letter to Jacob Burckhardt, which begins, actually, I would rather have been a Basel professor than God, the phrase at bottom, every name in history is I, appears to consummate Nietzsche's consciousness that he had been, as it were, emptied of his person. This letter, with its multitude allusions to criminals, aristocrats, and divinities, testifies to the fortuity of identity and the shipwreck of Nietzsche's lucidity upon the float of proper names. At what point did he reach the end of things? He was much too far out all his life. Is it simply ironic that it should be when the storm clouds lift, and with the general conception of his philosophy from top to bottom spread out in relief before him, that Nietzsche should disappear? If Nietzsche in Turin sacrifices himself to the chaotic impulses of the body, this may be because these clearly defined lines start to converge. If Sils Maria is the horizon upon which eternal return arises, Turin is its vanishing point. In the paratactic clarity of Nietzsche's final letter, there is a modest assertion. Look, my talent for landscapes cannot be denied. Perhaps this inspires Klossowski's poignant remarks at the close of the Euphoria of Turin, when he speaks of a loss of a horizon and the landscape of Turin becoming overlit. The horizon of the past came closer until it merged with the everyday, until they both occupied the same level. In return, everyday things abruptly receded into the distance. Yesterday became today, the day before yesterday spilt over into tomorrow. The landscape of Turin, the monumental squares, the promenades along the Po River were bathed in a kind of Claude Lorraine luminosity, a diaphanousness that removed the weight of things and made them recede into an infinite distance. A sense of place grows with the wanderer. Every now and then, a golden haze falls like a veil across the eye, and the whole landscape hovers. In this moment, persuaded that the sun has abandoned movement, that this perfect light will never alter, he falls. Filaments of light dance and dazzle, a glittering dust sponging away the horizon, unchaining this earth from this sun, leaving only the spirit wandering wide in infinite immensity. Little more than a sense of atmospheric electricity as a compass. In the beautiful introduction to his text Nietzsche and the Vicious Circle, Pierre Klossowski describes Nietzsche's work as flashes of summer lightning that a destiny sends our way from the horizon of our century. Rejecting the practice of evaluating Nietzsche's thinking according to certain norms of the intellect from which the philosopher singularly takes his leave, Klossowski's attention alights on the background of Nietzsche's thinking, the mute intensity of the tonality of the soul, as he so designates it in his own distinctive idiom. There is no denying that Klossowski's text on Nietzsche is profoundly odd. It is certainly peculiar that his engagement with Nietzsche's thinking should focus on his letters and notes rather than on the main published works. and certainly idiosyncratic, that he should take the landmarks of his thinking to be places where thought occurs. Two notable points in Nietzsche's thinking for Klossowski are his Sils Maria experience of the thought of eternal return in August 1881 and his euphoria of Turin, the final days of a kind of delirial lucidity prior to his mental collapse in early January 1889. Despite the specificity of this focus, however, Klossowski's interest lies not within Nietzsche's biography as such, but with the peaks and valleys of his psychogeography. One of the most distinctive aspects of his approach is his emphasis on the relationship between Nietzsche's valetudinary states and his thinking. This focus arises out of the broader insight that Nietzsche's thought meditated on lived experience, on the act of thinking, and is within this context that he insists on engaging with the eternal return as an experience, most specifically, most obsessively, the Sils Maria experience. In his thoughts coming to him step by step. When his migraines were so severe that he was unable to read his assembled notes, he would delegate the task to Peter Gast. Sometimes the headaches were so menacing that he had to abandon all the normative habits of philosophy. This is the first quotation on the handout. Nietzsche was often forced to give up all reading, all writing, all reflection. He followed a treatment, a diet, he changed climate. Moreover, he distrusted therapeutics. Little by little, he managed to invent a therapy of his own, derived from his own observations. Once he recovered his faculties, he tried to describe this suspension of thought, to reflect on the cerebral functioning in relation to other organic functions, and he began to distrust his own brain. After each of these crises, Klossowski claims, Nietzsche was gripped by a euphoria that led him to scrutinise ever more carefully the forces that had been revealed through the disturbances of his organism. In this way, the outdoors found a way into Nietzsche's writing. It may seem an insignificant detail that he developed his major philosophical ideas when walking in the alpine landscape. Ideas jotted on scraps of paper when breathing the air of the heights are later deciphered and transcribed, the pencil scratchings sometimes proving unintelligible, the connections between the ideas sometimes eluding even Nietzsche himself. Irrespective of the eventual formulation of these notes, one can only marvel at this method of philosophy. Picking his way across paths half seen, groping tentacle-like across mountain terrain, endlessly scanning the horizon, which falls away before the poorly focused gaze, Nietzsche navigated paths to new experiences. With what follows, I propose to explore Klossowski's unusual obsession with Nietzsche's body, his attention to Nietzsche's intensive affective states. Klossowski is at pains to establish that the body gains an essential prominence in Nietzsche's work, that eternal return is une pensée corporante, a bodying thought, and that his atrocious health, his migraines, neuralgias, gastric disorders and eye strain are fundamental material conditions for the production of his philosophy. In the spirit of Klossowski's approach, I propose to develop his account of Nietzsche's experience of the thought of eternal return in Simulacra, asking what is articulated in and by this proper name. These reflections on landscapes and headaches lead from Simulacra to Turin and into a more general reflection on what takes place at the edge of things. Klossowski remarks early on in Nietzsche and the Vicious Circle that Nietzsche's method was to take long walks